I was living in Toronto, and I had this agent who used to get me these really weird jobs. So one time, he calls me up and he says, some major film blah blah wants me to write 3 short erotic films based on the Delta of Venus by Anais Nin. I actually knew Anais Nin. I'd met her in Colorado. My thesis advisor invited her to Boulder. And since I was the only person she knew who spoke French, I got to chauffeur her around for 4 days, and a bigger, more self-centered diva I had never met in my life. But anyway, I started writing these stories about Paris in the 1920s. Irreverent, sensual, erotic. It was so much fun. And I was just starting on the 3rd story, longhand, when I got that dreaded phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning. Papa had had his 2nd heart attack. I arrived at the Jewish General Hospital, go up to the cardiac unit, and it's this huge sunny room. And on my left is this nonagenarian doctor in bed talking to his blonde bombshell of a wife in Hungarian. And she's only around 60 and looks like a cross between Ava, Jaja, and Bridget Bardot. In the far corner by the window was the most gorgeous Ethiopian man I'd ever seen. And Papa, sitting Buddha-like in his pale blue cotton pajamas, was translating the Ethiopian's Italian to the French-Canadian nurse. I gave Mama a hug, and then Papa, and she kept saying, "Don't squeeze him too hard, you'll damage something." Oh, we finally convinced her to go off and visit the 50,000 other people she knew at the hospital. And as I sat down, Papa said, "No, tell me the stories." And I had this flashback. I guess it was about 2 or 3 years earlier. The CBC had hired me to do research on a brand new strippers union that some women were organizing in Toronto. And during my research period, I had to come to Montreal because I had a squeeze in Montreal. He painted and sculpted in Montreal. And I guess the first night I decided I would hang out with my parents at their house. And while I was there, I thought, well, why not check out the strip clubs in Montreal while I'm here? It couldn't hurt. And when I was on the phone talking to the manager of this club down on Saint Laurent and Bernard, my father heard me, and I could hear him yelling from the living room, "Anna, you're going to see the striptease? I will go with you. Those places can be dangerous. I will bring my big stick." He meant his cane, of course. Anyways, we did go to the club. It was the eve of Saint Jean-Baptiste, and just a little bit tipsy, I asked him later on that evening, "Did you like the striptease, Papa?" And he said to me, "In Berlin, I saw striptease. In Vienna, I saw wonderful striptease. Even in Warsaw. This was not striptease. This was gynecological displays." Anyway, there I was, cardiac unit, Jewish General Hospital, and my father wants me to tell him these stories. Erotica for women, remember? And I felt a little bit embarrassed. I thought these were, very sensual stories, and I didn't want to particularly start talking about them in front of these total strangers, who, after all, had just had heart attacks. My father looked at me and he said, "Listen, you see the doctor over there, Dr. Rosenzweig? He's Hungarian. Hungarian Jews don't speak a word of Yiddish, and the Ethiopian only speaks a little Italian and Ethiopian. Why don't you translate the stories into Yiddish and tell them to me?" The Four Corners is really a story out of the 1920s in Paris about an artist who falls in love with a woman he doesn't know is a spy. Then she came over to him and touched him, and he came to life. And it was as though their bodies had meant to be together. Every part of them fit. And every piece of her that he had painted or drawn, he felt familiar with and yet surprised by. He used first gently his fingertips to explore her body, then his lips, and finally his tongue. And when they finally came together, it was as though two people like this had never made love before on the planet. And all through the telling and narrative, Papa would say things like, "Women like that? This is sensual?" I kept having to convince him that yes, it was. "And you think women like to be watched? they're so exhibitionist. On and on it went. Well, I went home that night, and the next morning I convinced my mother to sleep in. And I did something she would never, never have allowed had she been with me. I went out and I bought this huge bouquet of spring flowers. What a waste, she would say. But I knew my father adored flowers. He loved the smell, he loved the colors, and it was April. And just as I walked in the door of the cardiac unit, Dr. Rosenzweig, the Hungarian nonagenarian, turned to me. Now you have to remember, this is 20 years ago, and he said, "Miss Fuerstenberg, please, come, sit, patting his bed." And I thought, well, he's in his 90s. He's obviously had a heart attack. What harm could it do? And remember, this is 20 years ago. I sit down. He takes my hand and he starts stroking it, saying, "Oh, Miss Fuerstenberg, you are so young. You are so beautiful. You are so soft." Suddenly, the penny dropped. I said, "Dr. Rosenzweig, are you Hungarian?" "Oh, no, my wife is Hungarian. I'm Romanian. I speak perfect Yiddish." Oh, he started laughing. My father started laughing. Even the Ethiopians started laughing. About a week later, Dr. Rosenzweig passed away. And I remember that day at the hospital, my father asked my permission to go. I said it wasn't my job. He was my best friend. I couldn't do that. I'd miss him terribly. He just was tired. And my father, when they asked him if he wanted to have a quadruple bypass, said, well, didn't help him, did it? The irony? Dr. Rosenzweig was my father's cardiologist. And I realized that day at the hospital, when I was telling him the story and he was telling me how to make it a better story, well, it typified our relationship. Silly, raucous, and very intimate.